I'm Brett Godfrey, and this is Viewpoint. I am so excited. I can't believe how great this is going to be today, and I'm so glad that you tuned in to listen and or watch. We have a very special guest today, the eminent, critically acclaimed, best-selling fiction writer, John Gilstrap, will be our guest today. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. It's a real treat to have you on the show today. I first met John, I think, in 2014 or so at Gunsight Academy in Paulden, Arizona, in a special class that was a one-off deal that had some of the best instructors in the world. We had Rob Latham teaching pistol. We had Chris White from SEAL Team 6 teaching assault rifles. And we had Steve Tarani teaching us stick and knife techniques. And by the way, as a preview of coming attractions, Steve Tarani will be on the show in our next episode. But what I'd like to do is spend as little time as possible talking and more time listening with John. I've had a chance to chat with him some this morning before we started recording, and I realized I'm wasting valuable footage and time because when you hear John talk, you'll be amazed at the depth of his knowledge and experience, which of course reflects itself in the very, very high-quality prose that he writes. And his thrillers are literally impossible to put down. Before we get too much further, John, you have a brand new book out right now, don't you?
I do. It's called Stealth Attack. It is the 13th entry into my long-running and award-winning Jonathan Grave thriller series. Jonathan is a freelance hostage rescue specialist. And in this one, it takes him down. He does battle with the cartels.
Yeah, I have not read the book yet. I do have it, and I have read the synopsis of it on your website. I can't wait to pick it up. I'm just now finishing a novel, and as soon as I finish that, I'll start yours. I'm finishing Carr's latest, The Devil's Hand. But candidly, I think Jack Carr is a fantastic writer, but he's not quite in John Gilstrap's league. So it's just such a treat to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about Jonathan Grave?
Jonathan Grave is a former Delta operator who has sort of taken the foreign model for hostage rescue, which is if an American is taken hostage overseas, the mission of whether it's the unit or if it's the SEALs, depending on a lot of different things, the mission is to recover the hostage, and then everything else is secondary to that. Here domestically, the mission of like the FBI hostage rescue team, wonderful folks, a lot of them are friends of mine, I'm not casting any aspersions, but the mission of the hostage rescue team here is to capture the bad guy. And hopefully in the process, the hostage is rescued too, but it's not the primary focus. So when I learned that, I had done a nonfiction book that dealt a lot with the Delta guys. And I realized it'd be a great character to build where, if your loved one is taken, you don't care about whether or not the guy gets prosecuted, right? You just want your loved one back. And that's what Jonathan Grave does.
But in this latest novel of yours, the mission objective is a high-value cartel target as opposed to the rescue?
Well, it's actually the fellow named Roman Alexander. It's the son of one of Jonathan's colleagues who is on a trip. He's 13, 14 years old, and he's on a school trip down to El Paso. And he is picked up by bad guys in El Paso, and he just disappears. And of course, because I write thrillers, nothing is as it seems. But Jonathan goes down there to get him back. And Jonathan has done a lot of bad things to the cartels, and I happen to believe that that's from a writing standpoint, it's an underutilized group of bad guys. They're just really, really awful, and the stuff that they do. So that's what the story is about. And this, I gotta, here's your book. So that's what Jonathan does, and that's what happens in Stealth Attack.
And there are 14 of these books now. Is that right?
I'm working on the 14th now.
Oh, okay, so I miscounted. But and you've got some other storylines or series in development now, don't you?
Yeah, I just finished. It won't come out till next March. I just finished the second entry in what is my Crimson Phoenix series, which is essentially it's a post-apocalyptic series, except I can't say post-apocalyptic anymore because that always means zombies and weird stuff. It's post-apocalyptic in the way that Alas Babylon was,
Yeah.
and it tells the story of Victoria Emerson, who's a natural leader. She was a member of Congress, and they all get evacuated out in the event of nuclear war. They get evacuated out to a bunker, but they can't take family. So she resigned, didn't go in. The war happens. The war lasted less than 8 hours, and hundreds of millions of people are dead, but hundreds of millions of people are alive too. And so it's kind of the saga of her and others trying to survive in with no modern conveniences and with a lot of very feral people wandering around. Suddenly everybody is hunting and everybody is hunted.
I love that word, feral. It implies like stray cats, predators, and the like. And I think we all agree that if there was a total breakdown of world order, we'd be seeing some feral.
Well, look what happened. I mean, in the early days of the pandemic, where people were rushing for toilet paper and just jamming all stuff for me, into their carts, and nobody cared about who else was out there. I was sort of appalled. Some of these folks that I deal with in the Intel community and such, some folks who probably shouldn't tell me some of the stuff that they tell me. There was a real undercurrent of urgency that never made it into the news. We were very close to having a breakdown of the entire distribution system of food in the United States, which you got all this just-in-time storage and service. The way we get stuff out of warehouses now, they just don't have a big backlog. And when that broke down, we were very close to empty shelves in big cities. I mean, they were bare shelves, but they weren't empty. But now you get to the point where there's no diapers and there's no insulin and there's no heart medicine, things get tough quickly.
Definitely. When the life-saving medicines are unavailable, people die for reasons that I think are statistically misattributed to health conditions rather than the underlying cause of the shortage. That's been a complaint that I've read a lot about, people criticizing CDC statistical approaches to I call it pandemic, but to COVID-19. Let me ask you this. I'm imagining, and you and I have spoken about many things, but we've never talked too much about your work habits. And I'd like to, if you don't mind, ask you some questions about that.
Sure.
I take it that you work at home when you work on your novels.
For the most part, yes, but I can do it anywhere. For a long time, a lot of my books I wrote when I still had a full-time job. So I can write in an airport, or I can write at a bar, or I can write anywhere. But for the most part, yes, I work out of my office here in the house.
Do you have like a den or a special room where you like to do your initial writes and edits and so on?
I have an office. I mean, it looks like it's a very nice office, but you walk in, you say, "Wow, this is an office." It's not a writer's garret. There's nothing. It could be a lawyer's office, or it could be a writer's office. I like that because it's so not writing. You sign a contract and the book isn't due for at least a year, and not writing is very easy. And if you don't have, for me, if I don't have the office structure, a place to literally commute to down the hall, I don't know. It's a nice change of heart. If I'm in my office, I'm working, and my wife knows that I'm working, and we don't. May or may not take telephone calls while I'm working. And then when I'm out of the office, then it's just regular life.
So it's a psychological aid to keep you alert to the notion that you've taken off your run around the house hat and put on your professional
Yeah.
hat. And
Yeah.
when you're in there, you're a pro.
Right. Well, I try to be.
So on average, how many hours do you spend writing, say, a day or a week?
It really depends on where I am in the cycle. So early on, when you're just kind of getting to know the story and feeling my way around, um, there's as much thinking as there is writing, kind of pushing stuff around, and really intense time, maybe a couple hours a day. And now I'm on deadline for September 15th, so I'm like screaming. So I will do 8 or 10 hours a day at this point.
Do you find that if you have to work that many hours, that in the later hours of the day, fatigue begins to affect your creativity or your artistry?
It's not so much my creativity that gets affected, it's my back. I start out with good posture in the morning, and then by the time the day goes by, and I have back issues. As I don't know if it's as a result of that. I was a firefighter for 15 years, so that might have something to do with my back issues. But there's a physical fatigue to it. There's a discomfort to it, and that's typically when I stop. That will be why. Just suddenly I'm not comfortable. When you start thinking about your back instead of your characters,
Yeah,
you might as well walk away.
you're distracted at that point. So, have you thought about a standing desk?
No. Yes. Have I thought about it? Yes. And I have rejected it out of hand.
I
I don't get them. Now, a buddy of mine who is very fit, kind of pisses me off. He's so fit. He has a treadmill desk, and he's a writer. He writes thrillers, and he does, I don't know, very slow, maybe 1 mile an hour, but he's just constantly moving while he's writing. I admire him for that. I don't get it. I don't think I could work that way, but um, God bless those who can.
Well, I have some other friends that are also writers. Two very, very different guys that both write fiction are C.J. Box out of Wyoming and Wilbur Smith, who most of his life lived in South Africa. And people are surprised to find out that Wilbur's still alive because he's been around forever and ever and ever. I asked C.J. Box if he outlines before he writes, and he says, I outline religiously and color coding because I don't have time not to. And Wilbur says, no, I sit in front of the computer and watch the novel appear on the screen. So I'm sort of a reader as much as a writer when the first draft materializes on the screen. Where does John Gilstrap fit on that spectrum in terms of that type of disciplined pre-writing structural planning?
I used to, and when I first started, I was sort of addicted to outlining, where scene by scene you break it all down and you go back to writing. And what I found was that probably for the first 4 books, maybe 5. And what I found was that the final book looked nothing like the outline. I mean, like totally different. So I realized that I'm just wasting time with the outline. So I would much rather sit down. I know where I'm going before I start. I know the premise and a set piece or two in the middle. And obviously I know what the ending is going to be because I write a series. And hint, Jonathan Grave pays my mortgage. So he usually comes out okay at the end of the book. So, and the rest of it for me is the fun. You go out and you have a great pretend. And I mean, quite literally, sometimes I think I've made a mistake. I thought, well, now what do I do? I've got him into this mess. What do I do? And it kind of gives you an opportunity, gives me the opportunity to say, okay, all right, so what's he going to do? He's this special forces operator. He's got all the weapons he needs. He's strong. He's got, so what's he going to do? And I find that process is actually what keeps me going. It's like, I get to play with my imaginary friends, and it can be a very intense, fun sort of escape. And for me, what I found was by outlining, I'd kind of already eaten the dessert, that I kind of went through the creative process and wasted it on the outline as opposed to, and then I would depart from it. So basically, I know where I'm going. I don't know how I'm going to get there. It's like I know I'm going to end up in Omaha, but I don't know if I'm going to go via Boston or if I'm going to take a straight line or, if I'm going to scoop around to the south. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. So when you got yourself written into a box canyon, you don't back up, you find a way out.
Yeah, exactly. You have to. And that's where when Chuck Box says that he gets caught, he doesn't have time not to outline. Well, I don't have time to go back and rewrite. So I have to figure this out. And it kind of adds the excitement.
So you're on a roughly yearly schedule with the delivery of your novels?
Well, a year schedule for 2 series, so it's kind of every 6 months now,
Got it.
um, which which is really hard actually. This is the first time I've done these last 2 years. This year and the year before are both 2 book a year years, and both of the series are doing very well. And I certainly want to keep them both going. I got to figure out how to add a couple of months to the year and work this out. So, but it's such I get to make stuff up for a living.
And on top of all that cramped schedule, I'm trying to pry you out of your life for a week to get you to come down to Gunsight with me for a special class. And so
That's research, Brett. That is research.
well,
You
I was
know,
going to
it's
ask you about that.
uh, Jonathan has never fired a gun that I have not fired.
And you are a Glock man for everyday carry, is that right?
That's correct.
But you and I were talking about what pistols you would bring with you to Gunsight if we go in October, where we're going to train with Charlie McNeese, who in my mind is the finest pistol instructor alive on this planet. But you told me you also have a range gun, but I didn't ask you what kind of gun that is.
I have a Glock 19 for which I like the gun. It's just too big to carry.
I'm with you.
I also have a Glock 23 that I don't particularly like. I mean, the 40 caliber is just punishing.
It is.
And I've got other guns. I got a vest gun. I like. I don't know. Collect makes it sound bigger than it really is, but I like the engineering of smaller handguns. It's a stupid gun. It's a North American Arms mini revolver. It's about this big, and it shoots 22 Magnum.
I've seen them.
It's a belly gun, but the fit and finish of it is really terrific. So
Good
and
emergency.
I have
Good emergency gun.
yeah yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. So let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the way you research your novels. Of course, having met you at a very, very high level tactical training class down at Gunsight, a special one-time thing that's never been repeated. I think we were both very lucky to be in that class. But I figured out within the first 5 minutes that a lot of why you were there was research for your books. What else do you do because when I read your novels, I find that I'm always, always impressed with the depth of your research. And you know things that people don't make up. You have to learn them somehow. What sorts of things do you do to achieve that level of technical accuracy?
Well, there are several levels. First of all, this book I did, 6 Minutes to Freedom, back in 2006, really brought me inside the Special Forces community, and I visited the various compounds and training centers and all that stuff, and a number of those folks will answer my phone calls. So sometimes it's that simple, is calling somebody who really knows and say, okay, this is the situation. What would you do? And then taking notes. I like to. Wikipedia, believe it or not, is a wonderful source for the details on firearms and explosives. Also, my early career, for a lot of my career, I was an explosives and hazmat guy in the civilian sector. We made weapon systems. And so a lot of that I kind of know because I know. And what I don't know, I fill in with research. And quite honestly, Brett, a lot of it I got.
A lot of
I
what?
forget which was one of the. I make it up. I just make it
Okay.
up. And I got a call. One of the fellow on DevGru SEAL team, that really terrific guy. It's one of the early Grave books, and I put in some satellite technology, and he was mad at me, and he said, "John, you can't put this stuff in books." And I said, well, I made it up, but thank you. I've been in this business long enough, and I've been in the spookiness business for long enough. If I can think of it, then there is a top secret development contract on it somewhere.
That makes sense. That's logical. But the way you write it makes it seem anything but invented or fake. Your delivery of these things that are that are creatures of your own imagination are delivered with such crispness that they must be correct. So that's a tribute to your prosaic talent.
I thank you. That's very sweet.
Yeah, well, I can't say strongly enough how skillful you are. Uh, when it comes to um, gaining access to people with special inside knowledge that makes books really interesting. Obviously, the first time I think anybody ever really took that seriously, aside, of course, from Ian Fleming's own background in military intelligence, was when Tom Clancy came out and started hanging around in waterfront bars with sailors fresh off nuclear boomers and fast attack submarines, and gets them lit up pretty well. And suddenly he knows things that brought the president's attention his way, and he found himself in the White House. You do that in a your prose style to me is very different from Clancy's, but your research and the crispness of your factual deliveries is real similar, even though the prose style is different. Did you struggle for a long time to find your voice when it comes to those types of passages in your book?
I think for me, and quite honestly, I'm not being coy here. I don't understand a lot of what I do. I kind of sit down and I write stuff. But I think voice for me, like my first novel, Nathan's Run, came out in 1996. It was actually the fourth book that I had written, but it was the first book that I wrote as if I was telling the story to a friend. Rather than being all writerly and big words and all of that. I just told the story as if I was telling a friend. So for me, I think that's where the voice comes from. I was in the fire and rescue service for a long time. I've never been in the military, but there's a camaraderie, and there's a way that people in those lines of work interact with each other. And the rest of it, quite honestly, is much as you were talking about with Tom Clancy. I love going to places where people hang out and sitting very quietly and listening. And there's a guy down the street from me here. He's a retired CIA guy. And he came back from retirement for some 9/11 stuff. And then he went back. And I'm not interested in knowing secrets. But I kind of, it's the CIA. I want to know the spooky stuff. But I would never put him on the spot by asking him, because I think that's a wrong thing to do. But he has a Christmas party every year. And he brings all of his former CIA buddies there, and they sit at the bar and they tell stories. And they know I'm a writer. They might not know I'm there because, everybody's going back and forth. So just by sitting quietly and listening, you learn a lot. And then figure out a way to get that on paper.
That's fascinating. Of course, getting invited to the party is the first trick.
Well, that is the first, and there are ways to do that too, but you got to be sort of brash. I understand that there are a number of writers who are watching this program, and if that's the case, folks, don't be shy. Everybody loves to talk about what they do, up to a point. And if you cross that point, they will tell you you've crossed that point, and then you move on. But, if you see a cop on a beat and he's just standing there, I was in the car wash the other day, and he was watching his cruiser go through, and I was watching my Jeep go through. I just started chatting him up. He was a sheriff's deputy. I wanted to know, so are you, and he had sergeant's chevron. So I said, are you Sheriff Jones, whatever his name was, or are you Deputy Jones? And he said, and it was a little off-put at the beginning. And then I got into the dysfunctionality. I mean, he just starts talking about the sheriff's department and who he works for and how that. If you just ask the question, people will tell you all kinds of stuff.
Well, let me change, and thank you for that. But let me change topics just very slightly. I live in the south part of Denver, and in fact, I live in Castle Pines now. I just moved. But where I live, we're famous for active shooter situations. I don't know if you remember this, but
I do.
It seems like every third or fourth mass shooting is somewhere within 50 miles of my house. But what do you think is is causing this phenomena that we see in society now, where setting aside the debate about the Second Amendment, but just the statistical rise in random shootings, mass shootings. What do you have a theory that where that comes from or what's driving that?
I have a theory, and the theory has absolutely no, I haven't researched this, so I don't know if the data would bear it out or not. But I'm well into my sixth decade, right? And so the, kind of remember the '60s. I certainly remember the '70s, and things were different then. And you didn't have these mass shootings. You had a lot more guns, but you didn't have these mass shootings. So something has changed, and I think what has changed is that people are angry. And I think the anger starts at a very young age, and they're not allowed to act on their anger. When you and I don't mean to presume, but when you and I are in the same slice of time, if you got picked on by a bully or if something else, and if somebody wronged you, you got in a fight and you figured out who was better at fighting and who was better at talking. I was a much better talker than fighter. But you could adjudicate things and then be friends afterwards. Now I think kids get very locked down at a very early age, where the anger just builds and builds and builds and builds, and then ultimately blows up. And then you throw on some of the other stuff that's happening societally, everything from the pandemic to lockdowns, and I think people are angry, and you take somebody who's borderline psychotic and you make them that angry, bad stuff happens.
I had a friend that was a big advocate of the notion that the proliferation of psychiatric medications is somewhat involved in that. And I don't know if this is a subject you feel comfortable talking about, but do you have any sense of whether there's truth to that or not?
I have no, I don't know what the drugs would be or how they would interact. That goes to a level of expertise that I just don't have. I don't know what drugs do to people.
In your research of the cartels, you've I would imagine developed a more than passing knowledge about how illegal street drugs get into this country. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
And how did you research that?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm also a Mason, and I was at an event with the guy who was like number 3 in the border protection. This was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And so I was chatting him up, and he likes the books. So he arranged for me to have a tour with the BORTAC guys, the Border Patrol tactical teams down in El Paso. And specifically, I was pursuing my official purpose was to learn tracking, which is kind of neat, actually. But then you start chatting these guys up, and it's astonishing that anything that happens along the border has the cartels involved. Every illegal that crosses, as of a few years ago, I don't want to get into the modern stuff, but as of a couple of years ago, anybody who crossed illegally did it by paying the cartels something. The cartels cross here and do bad things. The human trafficking is horrifying. So yeah, I mean, it's a matter of finding the opportunity and sitting down and talking to folks and listening carefully.
Yeah, in my law practice, I have a department here in my firm that's working, and I'm overseeing it on human trafficking related civil litigation. And in that process, I've had a chance to meet some national experts on human trafficking and find out, how people are lured into that. It's surprising. You think that, say, for example, with prostitution rings, young girls are just snatched off the street, and certainly that happens a lot. But an awful lot of human trafficking subjects have grown up in fringe religions. I have a case right now involving Warren Jeffs, who was the head of the FLDS. I call it a cult, located on the border between Arizona and Utah. He's now serving life in prison for his activities with young people. And and the sophistication of these larger organizations and entities. I still don't know how to pronounce Navixum, or you know how, that human trafficking organization uh, that has now led to a number of criminal convictions and imprisonments. But they're very sophisticated, and they have a way of luring people in, and a addicting them to drugs, B, bullying them psychologically to the point of total submission and obedience, and then C, pimping them out. Uh, do you think that you'll ever delve deeply into that subject in a future novel?
Well, in Stealth Attack, I go into fairly deeply in a fictionalized way, of course. Um, I don't deal with real cartels and real. It just first of all, I don't need that heartache in my life. And but the events are, while not true, they certainly could be. And the reality is that there is a market, but for an American market, quite honestly, this trafficking of humans and children in particular wouldn't be an industry, and uh, and they are ruthless in it. And if you cross the cartels, oh man, you think the Taliban are harsh? These guys, they really they dice you up and leave you in little parts around the neighborhood. So the cartels are deeply involved in pretty much everything that's illegal that's happening south of the border, and frankly, a little bit north of the border.
Do you ever find yourself writing about violence, or, for that matter, sex? I don't see a lot of sex in your novels, but uh, violence where you think you've gone too far and it's too graphic and you need to soften it up a little bit?
I'm not comfortable writing that, so typically no. I mean, I was like I said, I was a firefighter and EMT for 15 years. So to me, violence is it's sticky and it's loud and it's awful and smells bad. And uh, so to the degree that violence is meted and described within the book, I keep it realistic. But I try really really hard, and I can't think of a single case where I have done this. I don't tip over into what I call violence porn. And I mean that as a very derogatory term. There are some very successful writers who I think do cross that line, and it makes me uncomfortable. So no, I don't. As far as sex in the books is concerned, I write thrillers. I have never figured out a way. Remember the big writers in the 70s and the 80s? There was always the sex scene. You're doing all this stuff, and boom, you got to go and we have a graphic description of lovemaking. I can't figure out where to fit it into a book. I mean, I write a thriller. Pacing is important, and it's like, oh
Yeah.
my God, the world's coming down. We're going to survive. Hey, let's go do it. I don't find a way to fit that into the story.
I'm totally with you on that. When I was a young uh, high school student and I was really, really avid into fiction, I read books by Mark Olden and Eric von Lustbader, and I later became very close friends with Mark Olden. But they would have some steamy, uh, literal pornographic sex in their books, and it almost seemed obligatory in those years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad to see that we've gotten away from it, because it doesn't do a damn thing in terms of advancing the quality of your prose. And some readers just, I think some writers think that some readers need it. That a book's not complete without at least one really steamy sex scene. Um, and it seems that that's faded away. And I have noticed that with your novels, as I've read them as finished novels, that the occurrence of those things is very scant, and usually just by suggestion.
And if it's there, it is always by suggestion. Um, you know, I don't I don't think that's what my audience is looking for. In fact, I've gone so far as to do this. In my early books, I'm a fairly profane fellow in real life. I think the F bomb is one of the most creative words. It can be used any number of different ways. Um, but I realize that now that it's not for everybody. And in my first few books, I wrote them as I would tell the story, which meant there was a fair amount of profanity. And honest to God, I got hundreds of letters and emails from fans saying, I wish I could share this story with my mother or my son or my grandmother or my friend, whatever. And I just can't because of the language that is in it. So I thought, all right, I look back, it contributes nothing. I haven't used high-end profanity in any of the Grave books. Maybe the first one. I think that's when I had my epiphany. But I haven't had any high-end profanity in any of my books. And they're violent guys with guns kinds of books. I would think they have a big heart too. But there are some things you don't need in fiction, and every writer has to find their way.
When you've got 14 books out or 13 books out about one character, I imagine that it got more and more clear to you who each of these characters are. But at the beginning, when you're putting pen to paper for the first time, how did you develop the person, to develop that character so that once you start putting him on paper, he comes down as a unique individual? How did you develop that?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I kind of do. There's an awareness that I started the Grave series. No Mercy was the first book in the series, and I knew I wanted it to be a series. All of my other books previous to that had been standalones. So one and done, stories told, and move on. This one I knew had legs. And so in No Mercy, it's the longest of the Grave books by far, probably by 60 or 70 pages. But I plant a lot of seeds for future stories. And for me, what makes what makes Jonathan Grave a popular character and what makes me like him so much is he has a very strong moral code. He's got a lethal streak, but not, you got to earn it. It's if he comes in and just put your guns down, you're going to be fine. But it'd be a boring thriller. You shoot back, there's going to be violence in return. But he doesn't lie. He's a philanthropist. He happens to, the long story of how he ends up with a lot of money. But there are lines he won't cross, and he will not stop until he has won the day. So when he says that, yes, I'm going to go rescue this person, he's going to rescue the person. We're bringing him back. Dead or alive, we're bringing him back unless, up to, if it costs us our lives too, then that's what we will do. So I think having that kind of moral code helps me. Quite honestly, when I had a fan talk to me probably 4 or 5 books into the series, said, you write Westerns. I don't write Westerns. He said, yeah, you do. You have the guy who rides into town, he brings and saves the day. I thought, okay, he's right. I kind of do.
I think there is some truth to that, John.
Mm-hmm.
So when you sign a contract, it starts a clock ticking, and you've got to get your book done. Do you end up writing furiously near the end of that interval of time, or do you maintain a steady pace all the way through?
Writing furiously towards the end. Part of what I do that helps me out is every writing session. I start every writing session by rewriting what I wrote the previous session. So everything is kind of polished. Nothing is really rough by the time I get to the end. And typically I try to have the manuscript finished, type the word at the end, which I literally do. You're not supposed to, but it's cathartic for me. If I can be there 2 weeks before the due date, then everything will be fine. I can do the rewrite and be off.
And you have, I assume, and I'm sure this is mentioned somewhere, but certain editors that you've now worked with many times over.
I have Michaela Hamilton as my editor at Kensington, and she's been my editor since 2006.
And so that becomes a close working relationship, I imagine.
It really does. And she understands my writing. I understand her hatred of adverbs, which, really helps. She also doesn't like nodding. She doesn't like other pet peeves that I do. The word just. Yeah. He was just this, just that. So I love her, and she's been very good to me. She really understands. And she's also, she'll let me have it. And she can do it in that very gruff, I've known you for a long time, so I don't need to spare your feelings kind of way, which I
Yeah.
actually appreciate.
Yeah. It saves time.
It does.
You talk about nodding. I think about Michael Connolly. Every fifth line in his book is Bosch nodded, and I always think, can't you put something else in there?
Well,
And
that's why Mike will never have a career in writing. You know, he
yeah,
just
right. Yeah, fantastically successful man, but he does use that word a lot, nodded,
he does.
and so it's interesting. Those little things, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners really like to hear about how that goes because I think most fans of fiction start to feel like they know the writer a little bit as they've read many of their books. They start to crawl inside your head and they start to figure out how your brain works a little bit. And then they want to learn more about you because you are, after all, Jonathan Grave. You are every good guy and every bad guy you've ever written.
Mm-hmm.
They're all you. And the readers want to pick that up. So, with that in mind, uh, is there a character in your series, in any of your series, that you feel is the most closely uh, correlative or most closely resembles the total package of John Gilstrap? How you see yourself?
Well, I think Jonathan Grave is the man I would want to be. You know, it's and he has much more hair, first of all, and he's taller.
Hey, no ball jokes.
Um, yeah, um, I there are parts even of my worst bad guys that reflect. It's not so much my worldview of things, but it's um, a certain logic. You know, but a good bad guy thinks he's the good guy, right? He's doing a logical thing from his worldview, and he is trying as hard to achieve his goal as the good guys are trying to achieve their goal. So, because I write in a very close third person, I am, for the point of view characters, I am in their heads and sort of feeling their heartbeat. So, I think there's a lot of my intellectual DNA in each of these characters in terms of who they are, but writ large, the Jonathan Gray probably comes closest. There's another one, Warren Michaels,
Yeah.
who is a character from ages ago. He very much, when I wrote Nathan's Run, he's been in a couple other books, but he was very much me at that time. Just spot on me at that time.
Interesting. So I read an article somewhere, and I can't remember if it was on your website or somewhere else, but you had written this article about selling movie rights and what it's like. Are you thinking of the article that I'm thinking of?
Well, I've sold them a few times. I think I know, but keep going.
Anyway, you talked in the article about the pros and cons of having someone buy your movie rights on a book, and I remember one of the articles says early on, when you're a starving beginner and somebody wants to buy the book rights to your book and there's cash in hand, it's overwhelmingly wonderful. And I think you said a really good Christmas at the Gilstrap house that year in the article. But then you went on to describe how there's some heartbreak involved in that over time, and insofar as either the book doesn't get made into the movie or you have absolutely zero creative control, things like that. Can you encapsulate for our people a little bit of your thoughts and experiences on that?
There are all kinds of different ways to come at a movie deal. First of all, there's the option, and then there's the purchase. An option is where a producer pays you this much money, and they buy 3 years worth of development time. So over the course of the next 3 years, they try to get a screenwriter, and if it doesn't work out, then the film rights revert back to the author. And what they're buying is the right to turn your story into a film. That's what movie rights are all about. For an outright purchase, they pay for the right to make this movie, and the right, they will possess the right forever and throughout the universe. That's actually the contract language, forever and throughout the universe. Now, the outright purchase is typically a lot more money for the author than the option. Um, so if the movie is not made, in the case of Nathan's Run It at All Costs, my first two books, Hollywood paid an astronomical sum of money for the movie rights. And then they never made either movie. And there has been some interest, and they ran up millions of dollars in development charges against it. So it's now in turnaround is the term. So if another producer wanted to make it, they would have to pay the millions of dollars to the studio that owns it just to start their own development process. So it essentially kills those projects. But I got to keep the money. And in the case of the option, I have one, the 6 Minutes to Freedom option is they have re-upped that thing, I think 10 times now. Well, probably not that, but 8 times now. So
And
it's almost like an annuity.
That's the nonfiction book.
That's the nonfiction one. And it's the only one of my books that is currently in development still. So, I think an author needs to understand that a movie and a book are entirely different things. I adapted one of Nelson DeMille's books for Word of Honor for a film that was never produced. It's kind of my theme. But, I was paid by the studio to write the screenplay. And the last person I wanted to talk to was Nelson. Nelson's a fine man. But I wasn't interested in what he thought the movie should look like because I already know what he thinks the book should look like, and it was too long. It has to be cut back in order to get it into a 2-hour movie. So that was my focus. So when an author hands his baby over to somebody to make a film, you understand they're creating an entirely new form of entertainment that may or may not look anything like the book that you wrote, but you get to keep the money.
That's always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So here's kind of a cheesy question for you. Do you have in mind any particular actor or actors that you think would be good to play Jonathan Grave?
That's actually not a cheesy question. It's actually an entertaining question. And here's why. In 14 books, I have never described Jonathan Grave. We know he has blue eyes, and we know he has a smile that he can weaponize to get things done. That's all we know about Jonathan. And I do that intentionally because, older readers sort of envision, and I get this from fan letters, older readers see it as a Bruce Willis type character which is great, except I don't know how old Bruce Willis is, but he's much older than Jonathan Grave. And the young readers see a Chris Pine or one of these heartthrobby guys in the role. And Jonathan is a very real person. I mean, he's based very closely on a real guy, one of the Delta operators that was very cooperative with me in doing 6 Men. So when I write him, I sort of see the real guy. And but I don't want to get in the way of what readers see. So, let them. I certainly don't want to discourage any producer from buying the rights, which, by the way, are still available in case, you're a movie producer and you.
Well, we'll make sure that gets reemphasized. Producers of the world, you can still obtain the rights to the good, fresh stuff by John Gilstrap.
In fact, in post-production, if you just run a crawl, it's operator standing by.
So let me ask you this, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, and I know you have a pretty busy speaking schedule and so forth, but let's say we have someone listening who's a young person who has never developed much in terms of professional training or the kind of things that authors such as yourself end up going through with places like the International Fiction Writers Academy. Or I know that I think it was last year you came to Denver with Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers Association.
Mm-hmm.
I desperately wanted to go to that and see you there, but I had a jury trial, so I was unable. But people who haven't hung out in that kind of a world and rubbed shoulders and picked up by osmosis some of the things that experienced professionals such as yourself know. But if we take a guy who just fantasizes and somehow really believes, a guy or a girl, that they could maybe succeed in this field. What would you say to that person? What advice would you give them?
To do it. It's there are I don't get into arguments. There are a couple of Facebook um, pages, I guess, that I participate in. Mostly I lurk and I try to be helpful. But every moment that you spend not writing is not progressing the writing career that you say you want to have. So the way it starts, it's like if you want to build birdhouses or play golf or write stories, you get a hammer, you go to the range, or you sit at whatever's comfortable to you, and you write stories. And recognize the fact that it's a learning process. It's a craft. Nobody's born with stories coming out of their head. And then there's a presentation of the stories as a craft that needs to be developed. So you just do it, right? And then write it and trash it, or write it and put it away, which is what I do. I've still got I got stuff I wrote in elementary school stored around the house someplace. Um, and understand that practice makes you better. And there will come a point, there's a tipping point, where you'll know you're close. If you think you're not, you're not. But if you read voraciously and then you read your stuff and you think, wow, this is actually pretty good, that's how you know it's close. And that's when it's time to start treating this as a profession, even if you're not getting paid for it. If you write mysteries, there's the World Mystery Convention is called BoucherCon. If you write thrillers, International Thriller Writers is the World Thriller Writing Organization. And that's where everybody is, whether every author you've ever heard of is there, every agent is there, every editor is there. It's where they go. So just as I say, I like to go, if I want to find out how spies interact with each other, I go and hang out at a bar where there are spies and I listen. If you want to know how writers and publishers and editors and agents interact with each other, you go to a conference and you hang out and you listen. You don't have to pitch to everybody you see. Maybe you don't want to pitch at all yet, but you do want to get to know folks and ask questions and listen to the answers. It's if you want to get paid for doing anything, you have to invest in a reason for someone to pay you. And you do that by getting better at what you do, right? Whether you become a lawyer or anything. And don't quit.
As long as you don't quit, you're bound to eventually make it.
Well, as long as you don't quit, you have a chance that you'll make it. There are, and forgive me, there's a hot button for me that it's nobody, no parent tells their kid that they should really be an actor or a dancer or a singer or a writer or, because it is such a risky thing to do. So parents push their kids to do something that will, and we push each other, we push ourselves to do things that will put money in the bank, more or less guaranteed. And that's important because you have to fund a lifestyle. But that doesn't mean that you have to give up on the dream. And I like to tell people that, my first book, which sold for several $1 million and millions of copies around the world, translated into 20 odd languages, it was rejected 27 times.
And what was that
by
book,
agents.
John?
That was Nathan's Run.
Okay.
And 27 rejections. And if I hadn't sent out the 28th letter, I'd still be a safety engineer and doing explosives and hazardous materials work, which is fine. Nothing wrong with being a safety engineer doing explosives and hazardous materials work. But if I had quit, I'd have been done. So I think one of the things people need to remember is that fear in any artistic endeavor or athletic endeavor for that matter, failure cannot be inflicted. It has to be proclaimed. So as long as somebody takes hit after hit after hit, whether it's rejections or whatever, as long as you keep going, you're still in the game. When you decide that that's it, I've got 27 rejections, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore, that's fine. There's no dishonor in that, but understand you quit. You chose to fail. It was not inflicted.
Well, I almost want to write it down right now. Failure is not inflicted, it has to be proclaimed.
Right.
That belongs on a plaque on a wall. You know what I mean? That's a brilliant. Did you write? Is those your words? Because
Yeah, that's mine. That's
that's
mine.
really
I
that's
just
really
gave away
special.
the end of my keynote speech right there. So
Oh, interesting. Well, John, it has been such a tremendous thrill to have you on our show today. I really, really hope I can see you in Paulden, Arizona this October.
I think
And
I'll be there.
well, I'm excited. I think you'll have a ball. You'll love Charlie McNeese, and you'll love if we get Chris Curry. You already know Chris, but of course,
Hmm.
but I just see this being a wonderful time. It'll be a small group, and it's not going to be a completely structured syllabus like the most of the classes there. If we want to focus on something, we just tell Charlie, and he'll make that happen. So it's going to be great. But thanks again today, John. Uh, I'll be kind of experiencing the high of having you on the show for about 2 weeks. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
And that's been this week's edition of Viewpoint. I'm Brett Godfrey. Thanks for listening.